Hello, everyone, and welcome wherever you're joining across the world. Thanks for joining our webinar today. As you're aware, the topic today is on CSRD implementation in 2026, i.e. post-Omnibus simplification. I'm Helena. I'm one of Agenda's partners. I'm based in the London office, and I have a background always within climate sustainability since the early 2000s. And my focus these days is largely on the compliance landscape of sustainability. So very relevant for today's discussion. I'm joined by my colleague, Victoria, who's one of Agenda's CSRD implementation experts, but I'll leave her to introduce herself in a few slides' time. Brilliant. So CSRD, as I'm sure you're joining, this is not a CSRD Intro 101. We're really launching into the post-Omnibus implications. And of course, as we know, when it was first transposed into law, it was the most extensive sustainability reporting requirement globally. And that's both in terms of the number of companies in scope, but also the depth of disclosures expected. We've now been through this omnibus simplification. We've narrowed the scope. The data points have reduced by around 60%. And thankfully, there's a much more pragmatic approach in some key areas. But for those who still remain in scope, this is definitely still by some distance. It remains the most comprehensive sustainability framework out there. So over the next 30 minutes, we'll be focusing on the practical implications, what you need to do, where to prioritize time, resources, etc. We'll definitely be taking a practical implementation approach. This is a recorded webinar. We'll also share the slides. We've got a Q&A box going, so pop your questions in throughout. We'll be saving some time at the end for questions. If not, we'll be more than happy to follow up after the webinar. Brilliant. Before we begin, a quick word on who we are and how we support clients. Agenda is a specialist climate sustainability consulting firm. We support large global organizations across all areas of sustainability, from capacity building, training, inventory, strategy, transition planning, and then reporting and compliance disclosure, which of course is the focus of our discussion today. You'll also see on this slide we're a friend of FRAG, really important to make sure we're getting those key updates in advance, ahead, really getting a full detailed knowledge on the reporting requirements. And we're also a CDP accredited provider. So quick sales shout out, if you're looking for a great consultant for CDP, do reach out. We have an excellent score simulation tool. Lovely. So on to an overview of today. As I said, we'll be covering the omnibus outcomes. Very quick snapshot there. We're not going into depth. We'll do a quick overview of what stayed, what changed, what this means, and then largely focus on the DMA, so the double materiality updates, the ESRS updates, and then practical implementation of what that looks like for each of the waves. And then we'll quickly cover value chain requests. Of course, that's relevant for those who have fallen out of scope, but also for those in scope to understand the limitations of data ask they can put in place across their value chain. And then finally, questions and Q&A. Brilliant. So starting with the omnibus outcome, as I said, origination, ambition, and the changes that have come. I won't be spending much time here, but a quick reminder that CSRD was introduced as part of the EU Green Deal, which is effectively Europe's long-term economic strategy to transition to a low-carbon, more resource-efficient economy. And so CSRD is functioning as a policy lever. It sits alongside the sustainable finance package and essentially the corporate disclosure piece of the puzzle. This disclosure is designed to support investor decisions, so it's all about making credible, comparable information available to the market. As we know, we then had the omnibus simplification. It was first introduced in February 2025, and a key part of this was the stop the clock agreement, and that allowed a 2-year delay for wave 2 and wave 4 companies. And as we know, there was quite a bit of back and forth, and definitely we don't have time to go into those perspectives, but thankfully, after the trilogue vote, an agreement was reached on the 16th of December last year. So if I move on to what was covered in that agreement. As I said earlier, the headline is that the CSRD, the scope was significantly reduced, as well as the number of data points. In terms of what stayed, still need to do a double materiality assessment to understand what disclosure areas are required. Assurance remains, although it will be kept at a limited assurance level. You will still need to report on an annual basis, and the overarching structure of the ESRS standards did not change. If we move on quickly to what changed, there was a scope reduction, rather significant, around 50,000 companies down to 5,000. We also have exemptions for financial holdings. Wave 3, so that was the listed SMEs, they're now removed from scope, invited on a voluntary basis to report. The sector-specific standards are now voluntary. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we have a protective rule for companies with less than 1,000 employees, that no data points beyond those listed in the VSME framework can be asked of an organization of that size. We also have the updated ESRS reporting to simplify those requirements, as well as a new digital portal for templates and guidance, but really this should have been a given in the first place. There's still a little bit of a grey zone in terms of the transposition, which will be finalised by the end of 2027. Victoria will go into more detail in a moment, but for Wave 1 companies that fall out of scope, they don't officially do so until the transposition to law occurs. So within the Omnibus, there was also an option for member states to exempt Wave 1 entities that fall out of scope. Brilliant. I keep talking about waves, mindful that I haven't introduced them until now, but we figured if you're joining the webinar, you have a pretty clear idea as to which wave you are part of. And we always recommend to get confirmation from a specialist CSRD council, whether in-house or externally. So wave 1 were the large public interest entities, formerly the NFRD reporters. So they're reporting again for the second time this year. They're already in terms of full swing of reporting. So the cycle of data collection, reporting, assurance, as I said earlier, needing to watch out for the transposition into law. Of course, wave 2, it's now narrowed in scope. It's defined as those above 1,000 employees and above 450 million net turnover. There's a delayed start in terms of what's recommended of how to prepare and plan. It's all about thinking about your double materiality assessment, hopefully making use of some of those pragmatic changes, which Victoria will go into a moment in terms of how you can simplify or even clarify parts of the double materiality assessment. And then, of course, starting to think about data collection, reporting, and then managing those material issues as well. So the wave 4, the non-EU groups with more than 450 million EU net turnover, and an EU subsidiary with greater than 200 million euro turnover has been defined. It's in terms of a preparation window. So now is the time to start thinking about the DMA, preparing those processes. We go into detail a little bit later on about how a double materiality exercise should not be a standalone feature, but embedded in your regular strategy and risk management procedures. Brilliant. I'll hand over at this point to Victoria, who will take a deep dive in terms of some of the practical implementation recommendations, as well as a more greater in-depth in terms of those changes.
Thank you, Helena. Yes, and the thing we look at first is the DMA and ESRS updates. So this is where many teams will feel the biggest practical changes, not because the DMA disappears, it stays as we know, but because the standards now emphasize decision useful information, quality of presentation in proportionality. We will cover 2 parts here, 2 angles, how the DMA process is refined and how the ESRS reporting standards have been streamlined. a core update for the DMAs, it's a refocus on the usefulness, or in general, the refocus on the usefulness of information for the reader of sustainability statements. So there are four main implications that we see. The fair presentation principles adopted. Disclosures need to be complete, neutral, and accurate. This is aligned with EFS, like an IFRS-style mindset. That means less of any marketing narrative, but very evidence-backed reporting. Second, gross versus net impact reporting. So what you can do with reporting your IROs and specifically with your impacts is you can consider mitigation, but what you cannot do is you cannot net impacts against each other into like one non-material because you have a positive and a negative impact. So that's not allowed. In general, it has been seen that in the first wave of CSRD reporting, there was some unclarity about exactly how to define an IRO, so an impact risk opportunity. So in the updated ESRS standards, there's a bit more clarification and guidance on the definitions. So for example, a positive impact cannot be presented as simply the outcome of preventing harm or simply reducing your greenhouse gas emissions. It's not a positive impact, it's reducing a negative impact you have. So that's one of the points that has been clarified. Moving on to number 3, financial effects framing. So you need to explain where material risk and opportunities may trigger financial effects across short, medium, and long term. So the finance linkage becomes more explicit. And last but not least, for the assessment simplification, so the methods are lighter in some areas. So for example, when you have impacts, risks, and opportunities, and then topics that are like clearly material or clearly unmaterial, you don't have to further assess them. You just need some rationale. Whereas you really should assess in more detail those that are borderline material. And the same is it's the same for the time horizon evaluation. So you don't have to now, under the new updated ESS standards, have every IRO scored over each time frame. That is not needed anymore. You can assess them on different time frames if it makes sense. So if you have risks that are clearly materializing later on, you should assess those later time frames. If it more or less stays the same, you can keep that assessment more streamlined. So overall, less unnecessary effort, but higher expectations on clarity and evidencing. Now, looking at the ESRS standards itself, the structure stays broadly consistent, as Helena mentioned. We have the same number of standards, but the content has been streamlined. So in total, we have 61% fewer data points. That's quite a significant amount. And we want to point out a few points what it means in practice. So we already talked about less pressure on value chain data, so the limitations for data requests on value chain, which of course also makes it easier to report if you don't have to collect that much data from your suppliers or have easier processes in place. Reliefs and phasing in, so there are clear transition periods for specific disclosures that are more difficult to report on. Number 3, principle-based narrative reporting, already touched on that point. Shorter and clearer standards in general. So of course, they're easier to interpret and implement, fewer data points, we already mentioned them. There are cost savings associated for the companies. That there's a study of EFRAG done on how much cost you could save compared to the previous ESRS standards. And now, and better interoperability with ISSB. So there's more explicit alignment with ISSB included, which of course matters for global groups that are trying to rationalize reporting across different regulations. One key point, of course, to mention here, one key next steps, is that this updated ESRS standard drafts need to be formally adopted with a delegated act. This is expected by June 2026, so roughly half a year. So that is something to watch and see, watch out for any potential updates or changes within the delegated act. Moving on to the more practical session, so what to do now to avoid rework later. What we are looking at, we look at wave 1, we look at wave 2 and 4, and what actions to take. We quickly touch on companies that are out of scope and look at successful implementation. So being post the final vote from December 16th, companies now, of course, have a much clearer view of whether they're in scope or not. So all this phase between almost a year ago when Omnibus was announced until December is now concluded. It's much clearer now. So the first decision point is, of course, are you in scope? Are you not in scope? Have you been in scope and not in scope anymore? If you're still in scope, wave 1, keep reporting. Wave 2 and 4, prepare for reporting. We go into more details in a moment. And then previously, wave 1, that becomes very, well, you need to watch the updates with the national transpositions for the countries that are applicable for you to confirm the exemption. And there are no immediate changes, of course. The transposition is, if I have that correctly on top of my mind, until 2027. So there's still some time, of course, for the countries to adopt the outcome. So something to monitor. And if you were previously in wave 2 and 4, the stop the clock, of course, has been implemented. So the strategic question for you is whether to adopt VSME reporting to meet, for example, stakeholder expectations, and to standardize your value chain responses or not. So in short, first action is the scope evaluation, especially if you're on kind of the border between in scope and not in scope. So looking at your headcount turnover in your EU countries on an individual level, but also on an EU-wide level to understand which wave you might be in. Moving on to the wave 1 reporters. First, they're of course in the process of reporting for the second time based on the initial ESRS standards. So what we think the smart move is in 2026 is to first, of course, finalize your CSRD reporting, publish it, look at your lessons learned, be honest where your process was heavy or manual, where you can improve. And then, of course, looking at the updated ESRS standards, watching the delegated act, and then understand how to update and integrate those into your double materiality assessment. So, for example, watching out for those more specified definitions for IROs. Second big part, gap analysis against the draft amended ESRS standards. So regarding the updated ESRS standards, of course, we talked about the delegated act. And then for wave 1, it's important to know that your financial year 2026 reporting, so the report you report in 2027, can still be based on the original ESRS, whereas starting with financial year 2027 reporting, this has to be following the updated standards. So you have some time and can early on do a gap analysis to analyze what is advantageous for you, keeping the same structure you now used for 2 years, and continue doing that for 1 more year, or if you want to switch earlier on because it means fewer data points that potentially were challenging to collect. Moving on to wave 2, Wave 2 needs to focus on completing their DMA and establishing data setup and governance. So we had the timeline slide before. In 2026 is really about getting your DMA finalized, setting your putting your controls for data collection in order to be able to start collecting the data you need to report, so that you can collect the data in 2027 and report in 2028. Looking at what that would mean for your, and I forgot to mention, Wave 4, of course, has one more year in general than Wave 2. So a bit more time. However, of course, as we know, the stop the clock intention was to give companies more time to prepare, not necessarily to not do anything and then prepare in the end, but really to have more time. So starting your DMA, considering your material topics, and then moving into preparation for data collection is also recommended for Wave 4. When we now look into a bit more detail on the DMA, of course, what we want companies to do, or what makes sense for companies to do, is have the DMA as an operational model and treat it as a repeatable cycle, not a one-off exercise. You have to, when you then start reporting under CSRD, you have to update it annually anyway. So it makes sense to also for Wave 2 and 4 companies to already set it up so that it can be updated on a regular basis. When you look at step 1, what has changed and what needs reassessment, look at, if you already conducted the DMS, so look at what changed internally, your strategy, your portfolio. Did you have some M&A activities? Did geographies change? Did your supply chain changed? Also externally, of course, looking at the new ESRS standards and whatever else changed in the world that might impact your material impact risk and opportunities. Step 2, do we have a robust audit-ready approach? So are you following the, do you have scoring criteria, following them, the thresholds? Are evidence requirements clear? Do you have clear data ownership and controls defined? Where can you standardize? Where can you automate? Where can you streamline processes? Step number 3, what is material now based on updated evidence? We score potentially priority topics or priority IROs using updated evidence, using all those changes that you analyzed earlier on to understand what has changed. Step number 4, how are outcomes embedded into your planning? So how are those identified material topics embedded into your strategy, into your risk processes, into your management, into your actions, mitigations, and so on. This is how organizations then move from producing a report to running a more defensible, efficient disclosure process. Looking at companies no longer in scope. For organizations who are no longer in scope, the key message isn't to stop, it's to simplify and to focus. I want to quickly point out, we are not talking about Wave 1 being out of scope. They need to keep reporting until the national transpositions are concluded. We're talking about the other companies out of scope. So Wave 2 for the complete Wave 3. So you still want to have a clear view of what really matters to the business and see a proportion and see if a proportionate materiality assessment is useful for you, makes sense to identify your sustainability strategy. That does not need to be a full CSRD DMA. You can streamline it. You can lead on other global standards like ISSB, especially if you come under reporting in one of those countries that adopts ISSB on a mandatory level. You can also look at GRI, which look more on the impact materiality side of things. From a data and reporting perspective, expectations also don't disappear. So investors, clients, supply chain partners will still ask for information. So look at how you could streamline those. And look at voluntary frameworks. For example, VSME, we mentioned it a few times. I come to that in a second to give a bit more detail on there. And also consider if you planned in budget, you think other areas might be more efficient to spend the budget on, for example, decarbonization. So there are some strategic reallocations that you could consider. Moving on to the value chain data request, because this is where many organizations get stuck, like requesting too much, receiving inconsistent data, receiving a lot of different types of data from different organizations. The Omnibus changes introduce here the very clear limit of not more information than VSME standards, especially for companies under 1,000 employees. So quick overview about VSME standards. So they, of course, are much more simple to report to than the full ESRS suite of standards. So the VSME standards are designed for companies, well, originally designed for SMEs, that's where the name is coming from. They're now also looping in companies out of scope for CSRD and act as a cap for what large companies can request from smaller suppliers. It is voluntary, so that's very clear. There are two models, two general models. So you have the basic model with 11 disclosures and the comprehensive model with 9 disclosures. You do not need to conduct a DMA before, but it's always helpful to understand, okay, what are the, for example, comprehensive models you should report on, because it's encompassing material topics for you. So some kind of high-level materiality assessment is definitely advantageous also to report on this. So in practical terms, for large companies, this should push procurement and sustainability teams to standardize supplier data requests for suppliers, this clear boundary and a structured way to respond once and then reuse. So we see benefits, of course, on both sides, the VSME disclosure side and then also the requester side, for better data, more transparency, the cap to ask for, so advantageous on both sides. I'm speeding a bit through this because I can see that we're almost on time, but I hand it over to you, Helena, for the key takeaways.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Realizing we're just at time. I was just furiously typing a couple of answers to the Q&A, but I think probably what we'll need to do is follow up with the rest of them online, especially there's a tricky one there about gold plating. So happy to provide some more information after the webinar. But thank you for joining us. In terms of the key takeaways, well, it's more about the practical next steps. Obviously, the really important thing is the regulatory timeline. The transposition at the country level will finalise by 2027. So it's really important to continue to monitor those updates, look out for any gold plating. Obviously, there was some gold plating discussions and restrictions that took place as part of the Omnibus that was largely focused on CSRD. Knowing if you're in scope, obviously a really important thing. Which way are you in scope? Are you out of scope? What do you need to do now? What do you need to do after it's transposed is really important. Thinking about double materiality. And so we at Agendi support a lot of clients in terms of double materiality, and it's quite exciting to support those on an annual basis because the process definitely significantly changes. It's all about streamlining. There's some new introductions in terms of only assessing borderline IROs, etc. And so really treat that as an embedded process. Build in those processes for year-on-year updates. ESRS readiness, also really important. Conduct a gap analysis against the updated standards. Obviously, a lot has changed. There's a lot of consolidation. The voluntary parts have moved out. We've got fewer data points. It's really important, even if you have done that historically, to update that exercise, understand where you're standing in terms of building a preparation response. And then, of course, this is CSRD is primarily about disclosure, but obviously a huge part of that is once you disclose a material topic, you need to give an indication of your management plan. So that's definitely a step where we see a lot of our clients heading towards at the moment. How are we going to manage these key topics? Are we doing enough? Will we satisfy the expectations around that? So treat those DMA outcomes and translate those into management and mitigation plans. And then finally, if you're out of scope, it may be a sigh of relief, but also you do have a really wonderful framework in terms of the VSME standard, and that will hopefully help to support any value chain requests and limit those pieces. I'm mindful we're 1 minute over. Apologies we didn't get to all of the Q&A. I think for the most part, it looks like everyone used their name, so we can track you down and definitely provide some answers offline. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to Victoria or myself. I think our emails were on here or maybe on the first one, but in any case, we'll be sharing you the slides and you'll get our contact details as well. So thank you very much for joining. It was a pleasure today, and please do reach out if you have any follow-up questions. Thank you.